The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 3rd chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. In the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip, ruler of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius, ruler of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. He went into all the region around the Jordan, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, as it is written in the book of the words of the prophet Isaiah, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways made smooth. And all flesh shall see the salvation of God. The Gospel of the Lord.
So as we move into the Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany cycles and seasons of the church here, we are going to read a lot of Gospel texts about John the Baptist. And usually, when we read about John the Baptist, we notice what a colorful character he was. And by colorful, I mean weird, unusual, different. And indeed, in the moment, John was a different kind of guy, and that was probably a good marketing strategy because being different got John a lot of attention, and it's probably why people were willing to hike all the way down from Jerusalem to hear what he had to say. But this time around, as I read about John the Baptist again, and I do confess as an occupational hazard of pastors, as soon as we start reading John the Baptist text and we know we got to preach on John the Baptist again and again and again, we go, John the Baptist. The thing that I noticed this time about John the Baptist was how not different he actually was. At least not different in the context of ancient Jewish prophets. Because as much of a wild and crazy guy as we usually think John the Baptist is, and he was utterly a conformist and a traditionalist when you consider the place where he chose to do his ministry and to preach, the Jordan River. Now it's true, that was not the temple, and it was not a synagogue, but the Jordan River was an iconic place for the ancient people of Israel. It is the place they crossed over to move into the Promised Land. It was another place where God had parted the waters and people moved in and out. It was a place where people expected God to be and God to act. And that's where John chose to. I mean, it would be as unusual as if a political figure decided to put up a soapbox and stand on the National Mall and start making a patriotic speech. You expect people to make patriotic speeches when standing on the mall. It's a little unusual, but it's a place you expect patriotism. And the Jordan River was a place people expected God to be working. That's what John chose, utterly traditional. John the Baptist was a traditionalist and a conformist when you consider his style and behavior. Now sure, he was eccentric compared to other people around him, but even when you look at the things that make us think, oh, he was a little odd, he dressed in a funny way and ate a funny diet, it did look funny compared to other people, but he was dressing exactly like Elijah. He was looking like other prophets. I mean, it's kind of like saying, boy, the pastor's dressed funny. Where's the funny robes? And I'm the only person in the room wearing this kind of stuff. But if you look at pictures of other pastors around, well, they kind of look in the same way. And so people walk in and go, oh, that must be the pastor. They looked at John the Baptist and they said, oh, that's a prophet. And like other prophets, John the Baptist ticked people off. I mean, we like to read prophecies about this time of year and we think, well, you know, what John the Baptist did, all these prophecies, oh, comfort, comfort, now my people, says your God, from Isaiah. And that stuff is in there. But often, and more often, the prophets say things to people where they say, listen, you're messing up. You need to live differently. You're not doing what God asked you to do. You're not keeping the covenant. And people were ticked off, and that's what John the Baptist was doing. He was being utterly traditional. He was being like a regular prophet. Because, you know, hardly anybody ever walked up to the prophet after they finished saying stuff and said, nice sermon, Pastor. That's just not what they did to prophets. And John was utterly a traditionalist and a conformist when you consider his message. Because after all, he was not preaching a new God or a new covenant. He was lifting up the very same God of Israel that brought the people out of slavery, and he was calling them back to live faithfully
to the covenant. That's what prophets had always done. He was utterly the same. In many ways, John the Baptist and what John the Baptist says and does isn't new or different. So what is different? What was so different about John that he was remembered not only by our Gospels but also by some other contemporary non-Christian historians of the time? You know, really the only thing different was the time. The time was different. The times were changing. Indeed, the times had changed. And because the times were different, God was also about to do a different thing. And people were going to need to live in a different way. And honestly, that's not different either in terms of the message. In fact, that's probably why prophets so often ticked people off. They always told people that there was a new and different situation and they were going to have to live differently because of it. And probably the root reason they were upset is that even when we actually know that things are different and I'm going to have to live differently, I do not like to be reminded of that. I do not like to have that pushed in my face, and that's what the prophets were doing. And indeed, even without crazy guys like John the Baptist, the challenge of living faithfully always involves recognizing a different kind of situation, a different kind of time, and being willing to adapt and live differently because of that, so that we can actually live faithfully to God into the future. See, in the goals that John the Baptist and all the prophets called people to are actually the same goals that God calls us to today. In every time and in every place, no matter how different the situation is, prophets like John call us to take our responsibility, to take our relationship with God seriously and personally. That is, to be personally invested in our own spiritual growth and in our own connection to God. Sure, there are lots of activities and people and structures that can help us, and that's really good. But there is no substitute for individually investing ourselves in the things that actually are life-giving, that actually connect us more deeply to God. And that's one of the things that John the Baptist always was talking to people about. He was repeating back to them things that he had heard, where people said, well, we are children of Abraham. We're people of the promise. We're people that were called by God, and that's true. So John's question to them was, how are you going to live into that? What are you going to do personally to live as people of God, as people of this promise? Instead of simply saying, well, yeah, I'm part of the group, so that's it. What is it that actually is going to make it possible for you to live into that covenant yourself? That's always the question prophets ask. It's one of the reasons that on the back, as you go out in the parking lot, there's the running to the feast thing we've been doing for the last few weeks. It says, what are the things we're going to do when the mortgage is paid off and we have a little bit more possibility and promise to do different things? What are the activities, not just that you think the church should do, but what are the things that you personally would find helpful to grow in faith? What are the programs and even the relationships that we should nurture so that you grow closer to God? What are the things we're willing to personally invest ourselves in to be the people of God? Those are the questions. And it's hard sometimes to figure out exactly what the answers are, but those are the questions the prophets like John always ask us. The answers may be different, but the goal is the same. The question is the same. Prophets like John always call us to the goal of never assuming that somehow or other the institution or the tradition will take care of things for us. And I think that's actually an important thing. It was important for John the Baptist and for others, and we've read stories from Jesus too, talking about people saying, well, look, there's a temple, and there's a synagogue, we're living in the land, and all that stuff. That stuff will always be here for us, and it's just going to keep kind of chugging along for the rest of it until the end of the world. Until it wasn't, and the temple was gone 30 years later, and people were thrown out of the land. And so what was the people's relationship with God going to be like when those institutions and traditions weren't necessarily there? And that was what John was calling people to think about. And that's also, I think, a really important thing for us at this time of year. Because as Christmas rolls around, I know I like to do this, I like to fall back into the traditions and all the kind of warm, fuzzy things that happen around Christmas time. The tree goes up just like always, and the carols come on, and all those kinds of things. And it can be easy to be lulled into this false sense of security that everything is just like it always was at Christmas time. You know, at least that's what we want it to be like, even though we know it's not. And somewhere along the line, and in the next couple of weeks, there will be people that will complain about somehow or other, you know, we got to put Christ back in Christmas, and the nativity scenes are being banned from public places, and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And I've always had a weird, not either or reaction to those kinds of debates as a pastor. I know it's weird that as a pastor I have a weird reaction to things, but one of the things that I'm always worried about is that this is a time of year when our religious symbols as Christians get publicly displayed on people's lawns, sometimes in public spaces. A lot of them are not religious symbols. They're Santa Claus and, you know, snowflakes and Frosty the Snowman and all that kind of stuff. But there are some religious symbols, and there are our own hymns that get played on the radio, and it can be really easy to therefore say, oh look, our faith, it's just part of the culture. We can just absorb it other people will absorb it by osmosis. It'll just be okay. We don't have to do the hard work of living our faith, sharing our faith, doing something that passes this on to our kids and to our neighbors, because it's just kind of there. And we can be lulled into that kind of false sense of security that we can just let the traditions and the institutions kind of keep rolling along. Christmas Eve, church is packed. You can't get a seat in the church. People that only come to church on Christmas Eve go, look, see, church is full just like always. No, it's not. But those kinds of traditions sometimes get in our way, and the prophets always call us to ask whether we're relying too much on the tradition or the institution instead of the things that we actually are willing to invest ourselves in order to pass on a living relationship with God and others. And that also means that we also have to be called all the time to ask and to consider how we're going to individually live differently, even when it's hard, precisely because we're taking our relationship with God personally and seriously. You know, it's easy to say, well, you know, I used to do this kind of Bible study, or I used to do this kind of prayer, I used to do this thing, and it kind of helped me, but now it doesn't work so well anymore. Okay, so what is the next thing we're going to do, or you're going to do, or I'm going to do, to actually live into that relationship with God? What am I going to try? And it's hard sometimes to figure out what it is and actually do it, even when it seems simple. Because some of the people that come up to John the Baptist, I think they don't have a lot of time. You know, it's late, they got to get back to Jerusalem. And they say, you know, tell us what we got to do. What we got to do, you know. And John tells them really simple stuff. You know, if you got 2 coats, share it with somebody who doesn't have one. If you got food, share it. Don't extort from people. I'm thinking, how hard is this stuff? This is easy, right? And yet, when it's a routine and it's something that you're not used to doing, sometimes that gets. I was reminded of that this week. 10 days ago, 10, 11 days ago, Blake, my little puppy dog, had elbow surgery, and they just went in and cleaned out his elbows, and it's been the easiest recovery that I have ever had with him. But still, they said he cannot run or jump for the next 4 weeks, so you have to keep him on a leash. And you can't let him, you know, so you can't just like open the sliding glass door and say, you know, go do your business out there. You have to get up with him and move around. I thought, that's easy. How hard is that? It's making us both nuts. I mean, it's really like, he sits there and he looks forlornly at the squirrels, looks at me, and like, come on, Dad, let me. And stuff that's simple, seems simple, really is hard when you're trying to change your routine. And that's the call of prophets like John, all times to say, you know, how has your routine maybe gotten in the way? And you need to think about changing that up a bit so that you can live faithfully into a new and a different time. And see, the really difficult thing about these questions is it's not always exactly clear what needs to change and how we need to live differently, either personally or communally, into a new and different time. I do not have all the answers to that. There are people that say they do, and they're trying to sell books on Amazon.
but they don't. And John the Baptist actually, and the prophets, they didn't have the answers either. But they didn't really need to, because they trusted that God was going to be with them through all of the changes, that God was going to be helping them, that God was going to be guiding them through that. They could actually see hope and promise in spite of the challenges, because they knew they weren't going to have to do it alone. God was going to continue to be there with them. So I don't know exactly what changes each of us needs to make personally or even communally to live into the new and different times that we're going through. But I do know that in every time and in every age, God calls us to live faithfully by taking our relationship with Him seriously and personally. In every age and in every time, God calls us to examine whether we're relying too much on our traditions and on our institutions to do the hard work for us. And in every age and in every time, God calls us to wrestle with how we're going to live differently, because the times we're living in are also different. Those calls are all the same as they've ever been. And they're the same because God is always with us. God is always acting to give us hope and strength in the midst of the changes. And most of all, God is always doing a new and different thing in our lives, because the times we're going through are also new and different.